So it's time for us to add some particles to this project, and after that I'm going to let the project be, because it's up to you to kind of go out and create your own custom variations from here. But the last thing that I really want to leave you with is the ability to add some simple particle effects so you can have some kind of cooler stuff happening within your environment. So to do this, what I'm going to do is right click, and I'm going to create a new particle system, and this is just going to be called p underscore bumper sparks. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a simple particle system that's going to like explode sparks out of the bumpers, so out of these, every time they're hit. And I think the best way for us to do that is to kind of generate a ring of sparks that are going to shoot out from here and then out around the world. So there's a couple of different ways that we could do this, but to begin with, what I would personally recommend doing is creating a ring, and then we go from there. So the nicest way to handle that is initially I want you to delete your initial velocity, right click, and go down to location. And I know location may not seem like the best starting place, but there's a reason for it, I swear. So sphere, click, and what we're going to do is essentially this initially creates particles popping in and generating them as a sphere. So you can see here that they're in roughly a spherical shape. If I turn my spawn rate up, you can see that they're all just popping into the shape of a sphere. But I don't actually really want that. I want a ring. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to disable positive Z. So now we have only half of a sphere, which is the bottom half. And I'm going to disable negative Z. So we now have them all just spawning within here. But the final thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go surface only, which means only spawn things on the outside of the sphere, or in this case, along the rim. So what we do now is if we check velocity, you can see that when these spawn, they start pushing out from the center. Now that's really useful for us because what we want to do is have a big explosion where they all shoot out at high velocity. And if I were to go down and set this to be 20, you can see they pop out like this. Now it's time that we set this up so that they are all exploding in a big bunch rather than just spraying out like this. And to do that, what we need to do is go to our spawn, and we're going to set the rate to 0. And instead we're going to go down to burst list, and we're essentially going to create a big burst of particles that shoots out at one time. So I'm going to go to this and I'm going to set it to 500. And you can now see that they all spawn at the same time, and it spawns 500 that shoot out all around. So with these popping out, what we're going to do is we're going to vary the speed of each particle so that they're not all just moving at a speed of 20. Instead, I'm going to go to my sphere, I'm going to go to distribution, and I'm going to change it from a constant distribution, which means a single number, to a uniform distribution, which means pick a value between two given numbers. And in this case, I'm going to set the two numbers to be 20 and 30. And you can now see that we get this wider ring of particles shooting out. Now, if I go up, you can see that we have a constant radius of 50, and I want to set this radius to be about 200 instead, because I know that the particle wave is going to have to generate around this, and I know that these are reasonably wide. So I think around 200 is probably going to be a better starting number. And this is something you can adjust to kind of configure to however you want it to look. For instance, I could do between 20 and 10 to kind of get this happening. It's really up to you. But what we need to do from here is make these not look like little crosses and instead sparks. So how do we do that? Well, we create a material for the particle system. Now to do this, what I need to do is, actually I'm going to put my content browser up here. I'm going to right click and I'm going to make a material that's going to be called m underscore simple spot. Now this is one of my favorite types of materials to create because it's something I use in many particle effects. And that is that instead of generating a round, perfectly circular particle with a texture, I generate it programmatically. And by generating it programmatically, what it lets me do is have a much nicer edge whenever we zoom in on the particles themselves. So right click and type in radial. And you'll see we have radial gradient exponential. So click on that, and what this generates for us, I'm just going to plug this in for a moment so you can see it, is a nice simple radial circle. So we've got this going. What do we do from here? Well, we go and we set the material to not be opaque. Instead, we want it to be translucent. And we don't want this to be the color, we want this to represent the opacity. Now at the moment, because emissive color is set to black, this is popping out like this. I should point out at this point that there are situations where you may want this to be additive instead of translucent, but for what I'm doing, I'm going to set this to translucent for the time being, just to keep it a little more straightforward. I'm going to go shading model and set it to unlit, because we don't really care about any lighting data. And I'm also going to go and set this emissive color by right-clicking, tapping in the word particle, and you'll see that if we go to the very top, we have particle color as an option. So what this lets me do is any particle color that's given within the particle system will output this node. The alpha value is currently not tied to anything. So if I get this and I multiply the alpha against the radial exponential, this actually lets me set it up so that this fades out, which is exactly what we want. So I've added a multiply, which plugs into the opacity channel. I've added my particle color, plugged into emissive color. I'm now going to save this particle system material, and I'm going to go back to my bumper sparks. And it's at this point that if you go to required, you can set this from default particle to be simple spot. Now initially when these load in, they're just going to be white circles. And that's okay, that's a good start. In fact, I'm going to use that to get my color system set up. So at the moment the color over life, if I click on this, I can view the points that they're currently adopting. So what this means is that at the moment, at 0 seconds of their life, so the very start of their life, these are white. And at the end of their life, they're still white. So if we wanted to, we could adjust this curve here, and we could have them fade from a color back to being white. So if I was to change this number from 1 to say 50, and this to say, there we go, that looks quite nice. So 50, 10, 0.1 were the values I just put in there. Now if I go down to alpha over life, you can see that these are also, over the duration of their life, going between the value of 0, so at 0% of their life, they are at 1 for their alpha. And at 1, meaning 100% of their life, they're at 0 alpha. So these are set to fade out. However, every particle currently lives for as long as the next. So I'm going to change this from 1 to be 0.1 and 3. So the lifetime is now going to have these particles kind of fading out over time. 0.1 might be a little early, so I might change this to say 0.5. And that gets us something that's a bit more like that. Now the next thing is that these particles that are shooting out are unfortunately, well, if you look at them, they're perfectly circular. But sparks really kind of adopt the velocity of the particle that's being shot out of them. So how do we fix that? I'll show you. We go to required, and see we have this section called PSA square. This means that every particle is essentially a square that is pointed right at you. But if we want to, we can click on this and say, you know what, make that square face along the direction that it's currently traveling in, which is what PSA velocity is. So if I set that and I go to my initial size, I want you to see what happens when I change the X values to be 2 and say 10. So the Y values are both set to 25 and the X is randomly between 2 and 10. You'll see that the particle systems are a lot thinner because they're being stretched along the Y-axis by comparison. And this lets us do some pretty cool stuff. For instance, if instead of going between 2 and 10, let's set this to be 10, 50, and 20, and 30. We now get these particles that are these nice long particles. I might actually crank that up a little bit further. There we go. So I'm going to save this system, and I'm just going to drop it into the world for the time being so we can see what it looks like. So I'm going to go here, going to get bumper sparks, and I'm just going to drop it into the world. Now, this represents one of the first issues that you can really get when you're working with Unreal and particles. At the moment we're using what's called temporal anti-aliasing, which is a really, really nice anti-aliasing solution, but it does have the issue that it can end up anti-aliasing out your effects because they're so small. So how do we fix this? We go back to our material, and I go to this section here, and I'm going to type into here responsive, and you'll see that we have responsive AA, and I'm going to turn that on. This essentially tells it to not use any anti-aliasing on the particle effects, and you're going to be careful where you do this. You really don't want to abuse it. But you'll notice that these are now much more vibrant when they're popping in, which is good for us. But it also means that when we look at this, we can see how we want this to be attached to the object, and like how big it should be. So if I was to put this here, these particles would currently shoot out at about that radius, which might be a little too big. So I'm going to go back to my bumper, and I'm going to drop the sphere size down to say about that, which is looking a little bit nicer. However, I will increase the speed. So I'm going to go sphere between 20 and 30. That's much nicer. So those are now projecting out and looking reasonably good. However, there's one other thing that I want to do. If I go to this and I right click up here, I can go type data. Now at the moment these are all being calculated on the CPU, but if we want to, we can actually push them over to the GPU, which means that they're way less intensive. So if I right click, I can hit GPU sprites. Now the only thing you've got to remember if you're doing GPU sprites is to change this to have a bounding box. You can see that there's a warning popping up at the moment. Now a nice simple way of doing the bounding box is letting the particle system play out, and at any stage clicking up here and click set fixed bounds, which is going to find where the furthest away particles are right now and set those as being the maximum size of the particle system for you to catch when you're viewing it. So I clicked there and I just clicked set fixed bounds. Now the thing with GPU particles is that it actually lets us, if we want to, turn this number up without really having anywhere near as many issues with performance, which can create some really cool effects. But be careful not to overdo it. So for the time being, I'm going to set it to that. And I'm also going to right click and I'm going to go down to collision. And this is another cool thing that we can do. Under collision, we can just set it up so that when these particles hit something, they bounce. So if I view this in the world again, I'm just going to have to drag it back in because I deleted it. If I view this in the world, you can see that when this particle system goes off, those particles would kind of explode out and bounce off of things and create some chaos, which is kind of cool. But it is up to you as to how much chaos you really want to create, so fine tune this number to be whatever you want it to be. I'm going to set it to be about half of what it is right now, just as a test, and go from there. I'm also going to set my lifetime to be between 0.5 and 2, because that seems like it would have been better, judging by what we just saw. So, the next thing that we're going to do is quickly implement it into our bumper. So I'm going to right click here, I'm going to edit the bumper, and what I'm going to do here, in the event that is bump, after we add the score, I'm going to right click, I'm going to type in the word particle, and I'm just going to spawn an emitter at the location. I'm going to click here and select bumper sparks, and I'm going to say the location that we want is the bumper mechanism's world location. And then if I plug this in and this in, we should now be set. Oh, there is one other thing, and you'll see the issue when we're playing, but it's good that you know what the consequences of not setting it up. Now, if you had been paying attention then, you'd have noticed that the systems were playing again and again and again over and over. So to fix that, what we need to do is in the particle system, we need to tell it to only play one time. So under required, you'll see that we have under duration emitter loops. I'm just going to set that to 1, which means only play one time and then it's completed. Now the other thing that I had was that they were spawning too close to the center of the bumper, and they were being culled out on the sides. So I am, after all, going to go back to here and set this to be a larger size. 150, maybe 200. I'm not sure yet, but let's have a quick look. And that's all you need to do. So go through, develop any particle systems that you want. There's some pretty cool stuff you could do. For instance, if you wanted to, you could add gravity, so I could go acceleration and tell these to start falling down and bounce off the ground. You know, there's some really cool stuff you can do. So have a look around, figure out where you want to spawn particles, and set some things up. You know, when the player's ball goes out, maybe you should explode the ball instead of just teleporting it. When this is a multiplier, let's have some celebratory effects going on there. So that's it for the pinball project. From this point on, I'll show you a couple of examples of different setups that we've had, but we'll be moving on to the next project, which will be a little bit cooler. It'll be featuring an outdoor environment and a little more action.